But we're going to continue on today with the book of 1 Samuel. Again, this is one of my favorite books, so maybe that's why it's going to take me so long to get through chapter 2. But I absolutely love this, and we left off after verse 11 last time. We finished Hannah's prayer, where Hannah, of course, was just this great model of prayer that we talked about last week. It was just exemplary. It was so good. And it is immediately contrasted with what happens in verse 12, which is Eli's sons were scoundrels, and they had no regard for the Lord. So we just go from one of the most beautiful, positive examples of just service to God and what that looks like, and to this. Eli's sons were scoundrels. And of course, we see this back in verse 3, right? This isn't the first time this has been brought up. They are known to not be good men. These are not good people. And we're going to get into some more specifics here in a moment. But it's going to start with this in verse 13. Now, it was the practice of the priest that whenever any of the people offered a sacrifice, the priest's servant would come with a 3-pronged fork in his hand while the meat was being boiled and would plunge the fork into the pan or kettle or cauldron or pot. Whatever the fork brought up, the priest would take for himself. And this is how they treated all the Israelites who came to Shiloh. Okay, now, the reason this is significant is the law of Moses has already been passed down. There's already a system in place, and there's already something that's supposed to happen. And the reason I want to bring this up is because maybe some of you are thinking, wait a minute, wasn't the sacrifice supposed to be entirely burnt? And there were 5 different types of sacrifices. One was the burnt offering, which was entirely burnt. There was also the grain offering, the sin offering, the guilt offering. But what this sacrifice was referring to is the fellowship offering. And for that, I want us to turn to, come up on the screen, Leviticus chapter 3. We're first going to look at verses 1 through 6. Leviticus chapter 3, verses 1 through 6. It says, if someone's offering is a fellowship offering, right? So this is the prescription on how we ought to do a fellowship offering. It says he offers an animal from the herd, whether male or female. He is to present before the Lord an animal without defect. He is to lay his hand on the head of his offering and slaughter it at the entrance of the tent of meeting. Then Aaron's sons, the priest, shall sprinkle the blood against the altar on all sides. From the fellowship offering, he is to bring a sacrifice made to the Lord by fire. All of the fat, the cover of the inner parts that is connected to them, both kidneys with the fat around them and near the loins, and the covering of the liver, which he will remove with the kidneys. Okay, so there's you're going to notice here, we're not just putting the whole animal up there and burning the animal, right? We're going to take some of the blood, sprinkle the blood, and there's certain things like fat that is being given to the Lord, and the kidneys, and the covering of the liver, all of this stuff. These are all things given to the Lord. But you'll notice there, as we go through this list, there's actually quite a bit of an animal that is still left. This is on purpose. Then Aaron's sons are to burn it on the altar on top of the burnt offering that is on the burning wood, and as an offering made by fire, an aroma pleasing to the Lord. And if he offers an animal from the flock as a fellowship offering to the Lord, he is to offer a male or female without defect. Okay. So he had to pick the very best. And then I want us to skip all the way to verse 17 because there's just more prescriptions on how to do specific animals and stuff like that. And it says, this is a lasting ordinance for the generations to come. Wherever you live, you must not eat any of the fat or any of the blood. This is very important because of what we're about to get into. And it really helps us to understand the story, what's going on. There's a reason why, when Samuel wrote this, he says it was the practice of the priest at this time, right? It wasn't what they were supposed to do, but it's what they did. We're also going to follow it up with Leviticus chapter 7. And I know you guys love Leviticus, but it's very important that we go through this to understand what it was these priests were supposed to do. Leviticus chapter 7, verse 28 to 32. And if you have an NIV Bible, you'll notice there's a little subtitle that says the priest share. Right? This is what they get. The Lord said to Moses, say unto the Israelites, anyone who brings you a fellowship offering to the Lord is to bring part of it as his sacrifice to the Lord. And with his own hands he is to bring the offering made to the Lord by fire. He is to bring the fat together with the breast, wave the breast before the Lord as a wave offering. The priest shall then burn the fat on the altar, but the breast belongs to Aaron and his sons. You are to give them the right thigh of your fellowship offerings to the priest as a contribution. So there was already an allotment set out of what the priests were to get. Now, the reason why this is called a fellowship offering and not burnt or any of these other ones is because this was actually kind of feast time. Right, I've mentioned this before, the different celebrations, the different festivals, the different things, that all these different ceremonies that they were brought to come back to at this point Shiloh, but eventually to Jerusalem. The reason you made this pilgrimage back to the house of the Lord again and again and again was not only to just for the cleansing of sin, but it was also a celebration. It was a good time. And the fellowship offering was quite literally an offering. You gave a portion to the Lord that the Lord would be able to partake with you, and the rest you shared with your family. Right? You actually ate this sacrifice. This wasn't just something you just killed and, just left the rest of the body lying somewhere. Right? There's a whole lot left of this. It would be cooked or boiled, and you would eat it. And it was very important that you didn't eat any of the fat or any of the blood. Right? That was a very specific thing that was being brought up. Now, why do I say all this? Well, it says that while the food was being cooked, the priest servant would just show up and take. Now, I want to ask you something. Is it the same as me giving money to a charity as that charity just showing up, reaching into my wallet, taking something, and walking away? No, there's a very different there's a very different thing going on here. Right? The whole point is that these were supposed to be free will offerings, freely given before the Lord. This was meant to be something that you brought. It was your decision. It was something that you freely did and you brought before the Lord. And then it was up to you whether or not you wanted to follow the law of Moses, right? Whether or not you wanted to follow the law and do the things that God prescribed of you, and then also be a blessing to the priest, right? Because the priests were given either the breast if it was one of the doves, right? Doves or pigeons, or there was a bunch of different birds, or the right thigh if you heard that or read that. Right? They were given a portion. Why? Because the Levites didn't actually have anything of their own. They didn't have land. They didn't get flocks and herds. They relied completely on the generosity and the willingness of the people of Israel to follow the law that was set out. So there's already been a perversion, a change that's happening. And this isn't that far out from the time of Aaron. Right? It doesn't take that long for us to take something good and corrupt it and pervert it. Verse 15, but even before the fat was burned, remember it said, what was the very first thing we were supposed to do? Burn the fat, burn the kidneys, burn the covering of the liver. Why are we supposed to do this first? Because the Lord gets his first before we do. Why? Because he's the Lord. But these priests, no, before the fat was even burned, the priest servant would show up and say to the person sacrificing, give the priest some meat to roast. He will not accept boiled meat from you, but only raw. This was against the law. The priests were asking them to violate the law of Moses. This was forbidden. Now, why do we have all this? This is meant for us to understand who we're dealing with, the time we're dealing with, right? Now we have a good idea of the corruption, of the perversion, the transition that's happened between the time of Moses when it seemed like things were going okay. I mean, let's face it, Moses literally went up the mountain and then they immediately began worshiping a golden calf. It's definitely in our nature to begin to just go right back to paganism. And yet, and so it shouldn't be that surprising to see that that's what's begun to happen. But the Bible, is very clearly trying to lay out for us, this is what's happened to the priesthood. Something bad is going on. It says, if the person said to him, let the fat be burned first, and then take whatever you want, right? So he's not even saying, here, let me give you, he's not even saying it's up to me, it's my decision, it's my choice. He's like, here, at least let us be pleasing to the Lord and allow the Lord to have his first. At the very least, the servant would answer, no, hand it over now, and if you don't, I will take it by force. This is becoming a major abuse of power. And of course, That shouldn't surprise anyone, right? Power corrupts. That's what happens. And these young men have been given authority over a nation. It ends up corrupting them. The sin of the young men, this is Eli's sons, was great in the Lord's sight, for they were treating the Lord's offering with contempt. Remember, they weren't even allowing the Lord to have his before they got theirs. We don't care if God is pleased. We don't care if God gets his. I want mine. You owe it to me. This was even happening during COVID. I saw this a lot with different pastors, and they'd be like, yeah, and don't forget, you still need to pay your church. Remember, you need to give it. And it's like, hold on. It's supposed to be a free will offering. It's supposed to be, this is out of the goodness of their heart. This is the thing that they want to donate to give to God. Like, we shouldn't be coercing people. But it's the same mentality doesn't just go away. And then there's a major shift here. But Samuel was ministering before the Lord. Remember Samuel? He's a good kid. He was a boy wearing a linen ephod. And each year his mother, remember I said his mom wasn't completely out of the picture. His mom would make him a little robe because she still loved her boy, even though she wasn't living there with him. She would make him a little robe. And she took it to him whenever she went up with her husband to offer the annual sacrifice. I can imagine, if you're that parent, right? You're Hannah. You're probably going. Oh, you're treasuring that moment. You're anticipating that moment more than maybe you normally would. Why? Because you get to see your little boy again. That's where he is. You imagine she's just sitting there. She's knitting away. She's like, "What do you think? What do you think, Elkanah? Is he going to like this one?" She would have been so excited. Of course, Eli would bless Elkanah and his wife, saying, "May the Lord give you children by this woman to take the place of the one she prayed for and gave to the Lord." Remember, I brought this up last week in the prayer. She didn't ask for more kids. She was satisfied. She said, "God, you're a good God. You're a great God. You've done such good things." It wasn't in her ask. We know she desired children. We know she wanted these things. But she didn't go to the Lord and say, "Lord, because I've given you this, would you please give me something back?" That wasn't in her heart. And I think that's why we read here, then they would go home and the Lord was gracious to Hannah. Why? Because she was that good servant. And the Lord smiles fondly down on his servants, the ones that are willing to serve without looking for something else. Have any of you ever served in some sort of outside of the bottom level of a job somewhere, where you have some people working under you? See, the people that you love the most, the best employees, the people you like the most, aren't the ones that are constantly coming to you and nagging you for more and more and more. It's the ones that are just there and they're putting in their best and they're working their hardest. And guess what? At the end of the day, when promotion times come around and raise times come around, you look at these people that are they're just pouring everything in, and you go, this is the one that deserves it. Right? Sometimes we think, we need to beg and ask, and I mean, obviously there's bad bosses out there, but if you sit there and you really apply yourself and you pour yourself into a position like that, that you will be rewarded, especially when the boss is God. And of course, the Lord was gracious to Hannah, gave her 3 more sons and 2 daughters. But meanwhile, the boy Samuel grew up in the presence of the Lord. It was a delayed blessing, right? She didn't know. There was no promise given to her like Abraham, where the promise was your descendants will outnumber the stars. But there was a delay in the blessing. However, her sacrifice was not in vain. This is important for us to recognize in our own lives as well, because sometimes we can feel that way. I've given up so much. What do I get for it? What do I get for it? Don't worry, your sacrifice, if you give a good and proper sacrifice to the Lord, not a sacrifice expecting something, right? That's not a good sacrifice. A good sacrifice is, I want to give to the Lord because He is the Lord. I want to give to God because He's God, because He's good, because He deserves it. Not because I'm trying to manipulate God, put in the right amount of coins, and hit the vending machine button to get what I want. The blessing may be delayed, but a good sacrifice always is rewarded. Now Eli, who was very old, heard about, and so we're going to go back to the evil sons now, heard about everything that his sons were doing to all of Israel, how they slept with women who served at the entrance of the tent of meeting. This is an important detail because this is a super common practice throughout paganism. Paganism had infiltrated, had subverted itself into the worship of God. So he had said to them, "Why do you do such things? I hear from all the people about these wicked deeds of yours. No, my sons, the report I hear spreading amongst the Lord people is not good. If one person sins against another, God may mediate for the offender. But if anyone sins against the Lord, who will intercede for them?" Now, his point here is very, very, very good. Right? If I go outside and I slash Carol's tires. Sorry, Carol. I've sinned against you. But we can have a mediation. We can sort things out. Right? There can be, but if I go against the Lord, there is no higher authority to appeal to. There is no higher authority that's going to mediate that dispute. When you go against God, that's it. This is good advice he's given his sons, but of course, we're going to get there. It says his sons did not listen to their father's rebuke, for it was the Lord's will to put them to death. And it was the Lord's will to put them to death. Does that remind you guys of any other story? Because it ticked a thing in my brain right away. I instantly thought of Pharaoh. Right? Now, many of you have probably heard the question around Pharaoh, and it probably went something like this. Was God justified in hardening Pharaoh's heart? Have any of you ever heard that? Yeah. It's a pretty common question. Until you study the Hebrew and you realize that, not that it's a bad translation, but that we have a bad understanding of the translation. I want to go back, and I just want to look at Exodus chapter 9, verse 12 real quick. And the reason I picked chapter 9, verse 12 is this is the first time I read it. Chapter 9, verse 12, this is during the plague of boils. And it says, "But the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he would not listen to Moses or Aaron, just as the Lord had said to Moses." Now, why did I say what I said? That word, hardened, I'm not even going to try and say that Hebrew way. In every other instance that this word is used throughout the Bible, we translate it as strengthened. So you see what I mean? But I don't think hardened is actually bad. Hardened, it means you solidified the resolve. The point being, and many of us can relate to this, maybe you've made up your mind about something. You've made a decision. I feel this way about X, whatever that is. But then life grinds you down, and you just get to a point where you just go, fine, have your own way. Right? Even though what you really want is this, right? In this case, what Pharaoh really wanted, he really wanted to keep his slave force. He really wanted to remain in power and control. He really wanted these things. But he just got to the point where he's just getting so worn down. These plagues just kept coming and coming and coming. And he was just getting worn down, and he was going, oh, man, how am I supposed to deal with this? And God said, I'll give you the strength to keep going. Right? It's not that God changed Pharaoh's mind. I just want that to be clear. God doesn't change Pharaoh's mind. He gives Pharaoh the strength to keep going, to keep doing the things that he already wanted to do. Why? Because God was setting something up. He needed Pharaoh to have a resolute spirit, so that way, right? We still had a few plagues left to go. We still had the plague of hail. We still have the plague of locusts. We still have the plague of darkness, which is a really important plague, because who was the main god, the king god, the big god in all of Egypt? But Ra, the sun god. And God shows up and says, nope, I'm in control. Did that tickle you the right way? But God shows up and says, I'm in control. Not Ra. What is this thing that you worship? It's me. And then, of course, the plague of the firstborn, where he says, I'm the one in control of life and death. Now, how does that relate to our story? His sons did not listen to their father's rebuke because it was the Lord's will to put them to death. Sometimes God gives our enemies the strength to keep doing what they're doing so that his glory will shine ever brighter when he does show up. If you don't know the way the story goes, they will pay, and they pay very, very publicly in a very big way. Why? Because God's going to show the worship at his temple, his way, these people, you will be punished. You can't sin against God and think you're just going to get away with it. This is important for us to recognize because we need to realize who it is that we're dealing with. We're not dealing with some other person and we can somehow appeal to a higher court or a higher authority and say, I disagree with God. How often do we hear that? I disagree with God. God's not right on this one, so I'm just going to put up a stink and say, you know what, God, you're wrong. Well, I'm sorry, but he is the Supreme Court. His decision is final. And what he rules cannot be overthrown. And he will show his power. He will show his authority. So that future generations can look back and go, oh, yeah, maybe we shouldn't do that. Maybe we need to take God seriously. Seems like a pretty big deal. And I told you we weren't going to get through chapter 2 because I was looking at it, I'm like, we're not going to make it. But I'll end with this, verse 26. And the boy Samuel, this is important, he continued to grow in stature, right? Not only did he get bigger physically, but also in favor with the Lord and with his people. This is showing you the type of person Samuel is growing into being. And this is going to be important as we finish chapter 2 next week. Friends, we have decisions to make in our own lives, and sometimes we find ourselves in these situations where we'll say, even to God, Lord, you're not fair, this isn't fair, we don't like this, I don't like that. And that's because we do the exact same thing that Eli's sons do. And we look at his law, his rule, his pronouncements, we look at it through the lens of our culture at the time, and we say, yeah, but it's not hurting anyone. Yeah, but the world wants to do it anyway. It's okay. It's fine. It's cool. But it's not. The Lord's called us to a higher purpose. The Lord's given us a higher calling. And I love that we can even go all the way back in the Old Testament, all the way back to even then, it was the same calling, even then. We need to live a better way. We need to live a stronger way. We need to live God's way. This isn't a new idea. It's the same idea repeated through the Bible over and over and over again. But it's the only idea that's going to lead to salvation if we truly take the Lord seriously and at his word.